Hello and welcome. First, I would just like to state very quickly that this is just a cartoon version of the introduction of the Pentateuch for the New American Bible. Now, out of my excitement to be back taking classes here with Step, I decided to have a little fun and make this tutorial, as my company calls it, for Unit 2, where you are asked to read this exact introduction to the Pentateuch. It should be noted, though, that I did take some liberties with the content on the board. However, the actual audio will be word for word from the text. This is merely for edutainment purposes, and not a replacement in any way with the official course materials. You could consider this as a little gift from me, and a fun way to refresh your gray matter after you read the actual course materials from STEP. Okay, now here of course is our slide list. Enjoy and have fun. The Pentateuch, which consists of the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, enjoys particular prestige among the Jews as the law, or Torah, the concrete expression of God's will in their regard. It is more than a body of legal doctrine, even though such material occupies many chapters, for it contains the story of formation of the people of God, Abraham and the patriarchs, Moses and the oppressed Hebrews in Egypt, the birth of Israel and the Sinai covenant, the journey to the threshold of the Promised Land, and the discourses of Moses. The grandeur of this historic sweep is the result of a careful and complex joining of several historic traditions, or sources. These are primarily for the so-called Yahwist, Elohist, priestly, and Deuteronomic strands that run through the Pentateuch. Each brings to the Torah its own characteristics, its own theological viewpoint, a rich variety of interpretation that the sensitive reader will take pains to appreciate. A superficial difference between 2 of these sources is responsible for their names. The Yahwist prefers the name Yahweh, representing in translation as Lord, by which God revealed himself to Israel. The Elohist prefers the generic name of God, Elohim. The Yahwist is concrete, imaginative, using many anthropomorphisms in its theological approach, as seen in the narrative of creation in Genesis 2, compared with the priestly version of Genesis 1. The Elohist is more sober, moralistic. The priestly strand, which emphasizes genealogies, is more severely theological in tone. The Deuteronomic approach is characterized by its intense hortatory style of Deuteronomy 5:11, and by certain principles from which it works, such as the centralization of worship in the Jerusalem temple. However, this analysis of the Pentateuch is an oversimplification, for it is not always possible to distinguish with certainty among the various sources. The fact is that each of these individual traditions incorporates much older material. The Yahwist himself a collector and adapter. His narrative is made up of many stories that have been reoriented and given a meaning with the context in which they now stand. In example, the story of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22. Within the J and P traditions, one has to reckon with many individual units. These had their own history and life setting before they were brought together into the present more or less connected narrative. This is not to deny the role of Moses in the development of the Pentateuch. It is true we do not conceive him as the author of the books in the modern sense. But there is no reason to doubt that in the events described in these traditions, he had a uniquely important role, especially as lawgiver. Even the later laws which have been added in the P and D are presented as Mosaic heritage. Moses is the lawgiver par excellence, and all later legislation is conceived in his spirit, and therefore attributed to him. Hence, the reader is not held to undeviating literalness in interpreting the words, "The Lord said to Moses." One must keep in mind that the Pentateuch is the crystallization of Israel's age-old relationship with God. In presenting the story of the birth of the people of God, the Pentateuch looks back to the promises made to the patriarchs, and forward to the continuing fulfillment of these promises in the later books of the Bible. The promises find their classic expression in Genesis 12:1 and following. The God of the fathers challenges Abraham to believe. The patriarch is to receive a people, a land, and through him the nations will somehow be blessed. The mysterious and torturous way in which this people is brought into being is described. Despite Sarah's sterility, Isaac is finally born, to be offered in sacrifice. The promises are renewed to him eventually, and also to the devious Jacob, as if to show that the divine design will be effected, with or without human cunning. The magnificent story of Joseph is highlighted by the theme of providence. The promise of a people is taking shape. Israel is not formed in a vacuum, but amid an age-old civilization of Mesopotamia and the Nile. Oppression in Egypt provokes a striking intervention of God. Yahweh reveals himself to Moses as a savior, and the epic story of deliverance is told in Exodus. This book also tells of the Sinai covenant, which is rightfully regarded as the key to the Old Testament. Through the covenant, Israel becomes Yahweh's people, and Yahweh becomes Israel's God. This act of grace marks the fulfillment of the first promise, that Abraham will be the father of a great nation, God's special possession. The laws in Exodus and Leviticus are both early and late. They spell out the proper relationship of the federation of the 12 tribes with the Lord. He is a jealous God, demanding exclusive allegiance. He cannot be imaged. He takes vengeance upon the wicked, and shows mercy to the good. Slowly the Lord reveals himself to his people. With remarkable honesty, Israel records the unsteady response, the murmurings and rebellions and infidelities through the desert, wanderings up to the plain of Moab. This sacred history was formed within the bosom of early Israel, guided by the Spirit of God. It was sung beside the desert campfires. It was commemorated in the liturgical feasts such as Passover. It was transmitted by word of mouth from generation to generation, until all was brought together in writing, about the 6th century BC, when the literary formation of the Pentateuch came to an end. The book of Deuteronomy has a history quite peculiar to itself. Its old traditions and law code are put forth in the form of discourses of Moses before his death. The extraordinarily intense and oratory tone fits the mood of a discourse. The book contains possibly the preaching of the Levites in the northern kingdom of Israel before its fall in 721 BC. If this book is situated in its proper historical perspective, its true impact is more vividly appreciated. It is the blueprint of the great Deuteronomic reform under King Josiah. This was an attempt to galvanize the people into a wholehearted commitment to the covenant ideals, into an obedience motivated by the great commandment of love. Israel has yet another chance if it obeys. The people are poised between life and death, and they are exhorted to choose life today. Well, that concludes the introduction for the Pentateuch from the New American Bible. We have reached the end of our little tune.